A foreign country not only with a foreign language, but also with a foreign script. The largest in the world, repeatedly attacked but never defeated. Proud and stubborn to this day, indomitable even if all the other large Western states continue to criticize. Russia is different, as is its capital Moscow. You must have seen that. Moscow, that's all I know. Moscow, Moscow, where shall I go in Moscow, sung the famous band Wonderland a million years ago, and the singer was after a girl, of sure. But I've got to get her back again, he sings, so today I'll take the train to Moscow. But this town is a very good destination for other ones too. It's the greatest town of all of Europa, a true capital with more than 12 million inhabitants. And 30 years after the end of the communist era, the megatown has nothing to do with all of the things we foreigners think about her. No, Moscow these days isn't grey, it isn't old, it isn't boring, dusty or in ruins. The opposite is true. If you walk the streets of the Russian capital, you will see a very modern city with a lot of interesting buildings, a lot of students and young party people, tourists from all over the world, and all the things you know from Paris, New York or Rome. Yes, they have Uber. They have Starbucks. Yes, they have bicycles to rent. And the internet is everywhere. It is quite surprising to arrive at the airport, because a lot here is still different than elsewhere. You can't just take a taxi from the taxi rank, because that's forbidden. Russia, a state that has had a large tradition of permits from the Soviet era, it is necessary to get a taxi cab at an extra booth. You are surrounded by countless taxi brokers, who of course all have the very best offers. Once you've got hold of a ticket, you're already sitting in a car, not in an old Russian limousine, for example, but in a Mercedes-Benz. The driver doesn't speak English, so it seems that is a good idea to give him an address. Ours is right in the center, right next to the Kremlin and Red Square. And the hotel is still not expensive, although Moscow is always at the top of all world rankings in terms of cost of living. The hotel is also clean, very cozy, and with a music bar in the basement, which we will talk about later. Another surprise when exploring the area for the first time, directly opposite is the state administration, a small district with large German-made cars that is guarded by military personnel. But they smile friendly and let anyone pass. Police state Russia, but nice. The whole city looks like it has been freshly cleaned. There are construction cranes everywhere, there is construction, and renovation. The traffic here in the city center is rather tame and clear, nobody honks, but that's not advisable, because at all intersections there are police officers who apparently also effectively prevent anyone from smearing the walls with graffiti, as is customary in Germany. Moscow is clean. Time and again you see women and men sweeping the streets, sweeping the paths and emptying waste paper bins. The buildings are impressive from the first moment, many are ancient, many are shiny new, and almost all of them are in excellent condition. So many churches. For a country from which the West has almost completely turned away, everything seems to be working very well. There is no longer any comparison with the old days of the Cold War, when Moscow was better off than the rest of the Soviet Union. But the city has never had a chance in these days to compare it with Western capitals. That's over. Now Moscow plays on the same level. So many churches, all with the unique onion domes, in between large townhouses from the time before the revolution. Moscow has parks and large squares, with the Moskva River in the middle, on which excursion boats sail, and impressive bridges from which the view opens far into the city. You have to try Moscow ice cream, a specialty, but also see what the Russians are doing while they are out and about. For example, they read, and they do this without a mobile, because they mostly read books. Everywhere they sit on park benches and in buses and in the subway, which is unique in the world. And reading. Really true. Where else can you see that? Past the famous Bolshoi Theater and the headquarters of the KGB, which used to be known to be so cruel, it goes around the inner city ring. Every stone here is pure history, a document of fallen empires, of revolutions, of great men and brave women. There are monuments everywhere, some old, some only newfangled art. The sky arches over the city with black clouds, but the sun shines on a Moloch that doesn't look as if it is 4 times the size of Berlin. Moscow appears contemplative, without the usual hectic pace of the big metropolises. A good place to be, we think, after a few Russian beers at the evening. Out on the streets the youth plays party. Red Square. The square, which has seen and experienced so much history, was once celebrated as one of the 7 wonders of the world. Here once paraded the victorious troops of the Soviet Union after the triumph over Nazi Germany, here lowered are the flags of the defeated, here lies Lenin buried in his mausoleum, here stands the famous department store GUM, and here once paraded early nuclear missiles launchers before grandfather Stalin. Today, Red Square in the heart of the Russian capital, Moscow, is still occasionally a parade ground. But otherwise, on all normal days, the place more closely resembles Times Square in New York or Shibuya Junction in Tokyo or Tiananmen Square in Beijing. Not so much ordinary Russians are here on the road, certainly not Muscovites. They are tourists from all over the world and visitors from distant parts of the largest country in the world. They come, they walk around, and they marvel at what a few years ago 1,100 masons, road builders, stonemasons, locksmiths, and restorers have impressively renovated, a long-stretched square, bordered on one side by the Kremlin wall with the Spassky Tower and Lenin's mausoleum, on the other by St. Basil's Cathedral and the Kazan Cathedral, the State Historical Museum and the GUM Gallery. Red Square is no bigger than 3 soccer fields. He is located in the heart of the city, is 330 meters long and 70 meters wide, with an area of 23,100 square meters. In 1990 he was declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, at that time still blackened by the industrial soot of the Soviet years. During the last recently completed construction work, more than 30,000 cubic meters of earth were moved, over 12,500 granite blocks were placed, and nearly 75,000 square meters of pavement were reconstructed between the Historical Museum and St. Basil's Cathedral. The slabs at the Lenin Mausoleum are now again from the original red Ukrainian granite, and the memorial complex for the heroes of the revolution has been redesigned. The Carillon at the Spassky Tower, the clockwork, and the sculptures at this world-famous landmark of the city received a rejuvenation, the brown-red Kremlin walls a weatherproof protective coating. For generations of Muscovites, Red Square was sacred. For millions around the world, the scene of great cinema hits such as Red Heat or K. James Bond is a mystical place of attraction. To this day, the historic ensemble is associated with the memorable events of the Great October Socialist Revolution, with Vladimir Ilyich Lenin's, the first ruler of the Soviet Union, with the landing of the peace pilot Matthias Rust, with the jubilant reception for the world's first cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, and with the coup against the government after the end of the Soviet state. Those who come here today are first struck by how large and empty the square seems, lying in the shadow of the Kremlin wall, which seems to tower higher than it really is. The square was a waste product at the end of the 15th century. Shortly after the construction of the Kremlin walls there was simply space left over. It was named after the color of the bricks of the buildings surrounding the square. In the beginning, the walls were made of white limestone. But because the Russian word krasnaya, which means red, still stood for beautiful in the old Russian language. An understandable choice of name, as Red Square is truly a beautiful square. Fortunately, Lenin never got his way, who wanted to transform Moscow into a city that was artistically thought out and comfortable for its inhabitants. What that would have looked like can be seen in the Russian capital's new-built suburbs, faceless and drab, with skyscrapers like anywhere else in the world. But around Red Square, everything has remained rather village-like, more village-like at least than in New York or Berlin. Police officers walk patrols, unagitated. Soldiers lay wreaths at the graves on the Kremlin wall, where deserving leaders of communism lie. At the GUM department store, advertising billboards gleam. And just across the street at St. Basil's Cathedral, which looks like a blob castle, the bus for the city tours stops, which you should definitely use. Where there are tourists, there are, of course, the employees of the tourist industry. Stalin suddenly appears here, then Lenin, the actually mummified Bolshevik leader of the early years. Tsarina Katerina is there, Ivan the Terrible, and Prince Yuri Dolgoruki, the man, who is said to have started building the Kremlin in 1157. As brutal and terrible as Russia's centuries-long feudalistic history has been, the square today seems light and easy. That hundreds of rebellious strikers were executed here in 1698 to 1699 on the orders of Peter the Great is hard to imagine, but true. And that is precisely part of the fascination that Red Square exudes. Families stroll by, tourists marvel, lovers kiss, Marx and Stalin pose for photos, and the Moskva River rushes by next door. But horrible ghosts are everywhere, when you're ready to think about them. While some of the buildings around the square can be visited for free, others require a ticket. But all entrance fees are cheap and can mostly be bought online, so you can avoid the queues at the Kremlin. A special advice at last, you also have to visit Red Square at night, when the lights shine and the wonderful illumination creates its own magic. Vladimir, 16 meters high. On Victory Day, the signs on the Red Square immediately catches the eye. In addition to depictions of old warriors from the great days of the Tsars, the central square of the Russian capital is also adorned with a whole host of signs from the communist era. 30 years after the end of the Soviet Union, the largest country in the communist world empire, the Russian leadership has come up with new idols. Yes, of course. 5 years ago, for example, a monument to Grand Prince Vladimir, who ruled in the Middle Ages, was created. A saint, a founder of the state and a warrior, President Vladimir Putin called his namesake, the Grand Prince of Kiev. Vladimir, he said, was a collector and defender of Russian soil and one of the most important rulers in the history of the medieval state of Kievan Rus, where Russia and Ukraine see the roots of their peoples, statehood and Christian faith. A large monument to Vladimir was erected in Kiev over 150 years ago, when Ukraine was still part of the Russian Empire. The two monuments look similar. Vladimir is depicted as a bearded man in princely clothing, leaning on a large cross with his right hand. But there is also a difference. While in Kiev Vladimir's head is uncovered and he holds his cap in his left hand, in Moscow he wears the ruler's cap on his head and holds a large sword in his left hand. Cross and sword and the black-orange cockade, they are the new signs of the new era that has dawned in Russia. But they do not suit everyone. Russians are still attached enough to the Soviet Union to tolerate what remains of it in the way of red stars, busts of Lenin, monuments to Marx and commemorative plaques for all manner of revolutionary heroes.
The Grand Prince Vladimir, which was originally intended to be truly gigantic but is now only 16 meters high, stands on Borovitsky Hill within sight of the Kremlin. But look, on a house wall opposite, a modern graffiti image recalls more recent heroic deeds. A Soviet soldier carries a child protectively in his arms. It is an iconic image from the great age of totalitarianism, emphasizing the historical and political stability of emotions once learned. Images of revolutionaries and heroes of the Soviet era have still a strong effect on the unconscious and thus on the emotions of Russians. Even if the heroes from former days committed crimes, most people do not want to completely separate themselves from them. Russia does not know anything like the cancel culture that is common in the West. Rather, what is too ambiguous to be worshipped without limits as in the past is overwritten. Lenin lies in his mausoleum, the KGB continues to sit in its old headquarters, it's just called something else. The subway station nearby has still hold her old and cruel name, Lublujanka. The state symbolism of the old days, when Russia was still one of only two world powers, has survived the transformation phase of the post-communist countries because its functions in the multi-ethnic state of the Soviet Union were absolute. The Soviet star, the red flag, Lenin and Stalin, they were the representation of the state to the outside world and they created identity formation on the inside. In terms of foreign policy, the reformed or newly developed state symbolism symbolized the sovereignty of the states concerned. In terms of domestic policy, it served to integrate the citizens under virtual signs. The king of the Soviet Union, however, is still Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, fighting name, Lenin. Standing and sitting, made of bronze or natural stone, in front of a university or a cemetery, in Moscow one constantly encounters statues and busts depicting the father of the Great October Socialist Revolution. From the larger-than-life statue in the Moscow Sculpture Park to the small commemorative plaque, Lenin is everywhere. Stalin, his bloodthirsty successor, is rarer, but his tomb on the Kremlin wall has again been a pilgrimage site for Russian communists for years. Since the removal of Stalin's embalmed body from the Lenin-Stalin mausoleum in 1961, the ruler, who died in 1953, has rested in the necropolis on the Kremlin wall. There, among others, are the funerary monuments of CP General Secretaries Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, who died between 1982 and 1985. A grey bust commemorates the once feared Georgian, whose real name was Iosif Jugashvili. In the Moscow souvenir stores, for example on the Old Arbit or at the Military Museum, on the other hand, Stalin is the absolute star. Here you can find not only cheap copies of Faberge eggs, but also busts of Stalin, Lenin, and President Putin. Next to them are the famous Russian Matryoshka dolls, painted as Stalin, but also as Lenin, Putin, John Lennon, and Donald Trump. Russian humor or pure capitalist profiteering? Who knows? At the GUM. It is one of the most visited places in the Russian capital. However, hardly any citizen can afford anything in what is probably the most exclusive department store in the giant empire. Right next to the Kremlin and Red Square, the epitome of communism, the Moscow department store GUM has stood for exactly 125 years, and is more popular than ever before in its history. On December 2, 1893, it was opened to the people as a bazaar. The State Universal Department Store, better known as GUM, is an amazing sight at the front of Red Square. A sculpture for the power of capitalism, in the middle of the former communist nowhere. In Soviet times, there were long queues here, because it was a little bit possible to catch something from the extremely scarce range of consumer goods. Today, there is a cultivated emptiness in there. One posh boutique follows another. All of the Grest names from the West are here, Ralph Lauren, Gucci, Rolex, Adidas. But no single Muscovite strays here anymore. Most tourists, too, only glance at the price tags, which, by the way, give information in dollars, and move on, impressed. Small crowds are waiting only before the mobile ice cream vendors, who have been able to defend their traditional sales spots. The complicated name GUM stands for Gosударственный Universalny Magazine, which is almost unpronounceable for non-Russians. The GUM department store is until today the largest in the former Soviet Union and an architectural gem. The three-story building, 90 meters wide and 250 meters long, located on Red Square across from the Kremlin, was built in 1890 in the Russian style. Originally a trading house, it was converted into a state department store in 1921. An early work of the communists, no joke. Today, after the capitalists took over again, most of the stores under the arcades are empty. But the beautiful department store with its nostalgic flair attracts German and other foreign companies and investors, so that there is no need to fear for its continued existence. It seems they don't need consumers, because all of the stores are more like store windows to another world. Today, the most expensive goods in the country can be found here. Foreign luxury boutiques line up with stalls selling exquisite caviar for several thousand euros. Only a few stores even offer goods that Muscovites can afford on an average income of 68,000 rubles, about 900 euros, a month. If you want to relieve yourself in the historic toilet with its decorated door handles, you have to pay 150 rubles, about 2 euros. The shopping center, opened during the Tsarist rule, was temporarily closed and converted under the Soviets. In 1953, after the death of dictator Joseph Stalin, it was renovated and for decades represented an exception to the economy of scarcity. Today, the main owner of the former State Department store GUM is the Russian fashion company Bosko de Siligi, whose owner Mikhail Kuznerovich is said to have good connections with Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin. The special flair of the former socialist temple of consumption is mainly due to the magnificent interior design. Ornate little bridges and walkways connect three corridors that extend over several floors. With a total area of 75,000 square meters, the GUM is as large as about 11 soccer fields side by side. As tourists stroll through the aisles, they glimpse several Russian eras at once, from the Tsarist era to Soviet kitsch to modern architecture. The management of GUM sees no competition in the consumer hell variety of the capital. In winter, therefore, salespeople dressed as Father Frost boost Christmas and New Year's Eve business. In summer, the department store attracts visitors with countless varieties of plomber, the milk ice cream that has been popular with the people since Soviet times. The iconic department store attracts 16 million visitors a year, but 95% of them come just to take a shy look around the magnificent building. But the Muscovites are incredibly proud of this strange palace of absurdity. Conquerors of space. The little boy on his skateboard races past the enormous granite base of the Moscow Cosmos Monument, a 109-meter-high obelisk made of titanium that rises into the wide and clear blue Russian sky like a curved arrow. The area around the famous Museum of the Cosmonauts it is equally large and expansive, an area that seems to imitate the infinite expanses of space for the visitor down on Earth. A thoroughly intentional effect, because as the name of the monument suggests, which is for the conquerors of space, Russia still sees itself as the greatest spacefaring nation of the Earth. And the Museum of Cosmonauts, which opened in 1959 and was completely redesigned in 2009, is correspondingly large and splendid, unsurpassed, and exciting. The dusty museum from the Soviet era has been transformed into a modern exhibition with many space apparatuses and flight simulators. From the R-7, at the time the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, to the first satellite Sputnik, the Mir, Peace, space station and the Buran space shuttle, named Oyfter Asian Wind, everything Russia contributed to the conquest of space can be seen here. "We were the first in space" is written on a giant balloon in front of the new museum. Russia is using it to commemorate the fact that the Soviet Union was the first nation to launch an artificial Earth satellite, Sputnik, into space in 1957. It was followed by Yuri Gagarin on April 12, 1961, who was the first person to orbit the Earth in a spacecraft. It is impressive how tiny all the flying machines were, how Stone Age the switches and buttons look today, and how crazy people must have been who ventured into the infinity of space in these tin cans. According to own informations of the institution, there are about 3,500 attractions in the Moscow Museum. Among them is a walk-through replica of the Soviet Mir space station, which sank in the Pacific in 2001, a movie theater that runs explanatory films, and a mini-flight control center for live connections to the International Space Station, ISS. As an interactive museum, the large low-rise building aims to let every visitor experience a rocket launch, landings, and other phases of a space flight. But of course, it takes imagination to do this because you cannot bin Jeff Bezos and have a real flight. But it works. At this place you come nearer to the sky than everywhere else. You can see and touch the real instruments, the seats of an spacecraft, the jackets, and the overalls. The total remodeling of the old-fashioned exhibition from Soviet times took 3 years to Russia's Palace of Proud, running parallel to a comeback of the Russian space industry, which has become almost as important again under Vladimir Putin as it was in communist times. Russia wants to stay ahead in space, and the GLONASS, Global Navigation Satellite System, has shown that it can. In the Prestige project, a competitor to the American GPS system, Russia has overtaken the EU. If it is to continue to succeed, it needs new talent. And to attract them, it needs the same kind of enthusiasm like the Soviets have had. The facility next to the memorial to the conquerors of space with its many space machines, video walls, and flight simulators is intended to generate this enthusiasm.
The goal is to show the magnificence of space, as it is officially called. Today 4 times larger than originally, the house offers 8,500 square meters of exhibition space, through which one can wander for hours to see rockets and rocket models, space shuttles, ejection seats, Soyuz capsules, space suits, tools and photographs. In addition, there are reports on the first animal space pioneers, the dogs Laika, Streka, and Belka, and their human successors, who came from countries that no one would believe today. Muhammad Ahmed Faris was Syrian, Abdul Ahad Momand Afghan origin. What this guys felt when their rocket took off is made clear by a flight simulator in which space fans can get a feel for weightlessness. As in the case of the other major space nation, which operates similar museums in Houston, for example, the tour ends directly outside through a large souvenir store, which sells toy rockets, Soyuz t-shirts, space suits for carnivals and model kits. For a smaller amount OB rubles you can get as well as real cosmonaut food. Red walls, a wide field behind, with meadows, big cannons, golden roofs and impressive church buildings. The Kremlin in Moscow is not only the heart in the middle of the largest nation in the world in terms of area, but also architecturally an impressive structure. The Holy Kremlin. More than 500 years then is the fortification complex, which consists of a triangular boundary wall with 20 towers. Built for the most part between 1485 and 1499, the entire ensemble still looks like new today. The Tsars used to rule from here, later the murderous communist dictator Stalin ruled from here with an iron hand. The Moscow Kremlin is the oldest and central part of Moscow on Borovitsky Hill on the left bank of the Moskva River. Since 1992, the Russian government has been sitting in the Kremlin, somewhere in one of the sprawling buildings to which visitors are not allowed access. Everything else, however, is free to walk and to visit. Uniformed guards watch over the marble Lenin mausoleum on the outer wall, which, smooth and straight, looks like a foreign body against the ornate Kremlin walls. But visitors can only enter the Kremlin if you have paid the entrance fee and passed a security check, but then you are free to go wherever you want, except for the parts of the Kremlin that are closed to visitors, such as the Senate or the Tarim Palace. Even so, there is plenty to see between the octagonal bell tower Ivan the Great and the Archangel Michael, Assumption and Annunciation cathedrals. The latter was the coronation church of all Tsars and is the most famous building with its gilded domes. In the interior, one involuntarily gasps for breath. The building is decorated all over with frescoes, which makes it seem gloomy and, in a way, cramped. Between the nave and the altar rises a magnificent iconostasis, the wall decorated with icons how are common in Orthodox churches. Russian believers kiss the icons they venerate. Here Western Europe is suddenly very distant again. This day the Kremlin is not what it once was, the largest church of Soviet communism, an ideology who was buried a quarter of a century ago. At the beginning of his era the leaders of the revolution decided to make the Kremlin to a palace of the Soviet. After 1935, there have been no more eagles dotting the Kremlin walls from Spassky, Nikolsky, Borovitsky and Troitsky towers. Instead, the communists crowned the 4 towers with 5-pointed stars with a hammer and sickle. Supposedly, the 5-pointed star only became the symbol of Soviet power in the first place because Leon Trotsky, who was still powerful at the time, he was later assassinated in exile in Mexico on Stalin's orders with an ice pick, believed the pentagram had a strong energy potential. The traditional double-headed eagles fell, the first stars, still huge and clumsily designed, followed. They were later replaced by ruby-red shining examples, the smallest on the Vodosvodnaya Tower, the largest, with a beam length of 4 meters after all, on the Spassky and Nikolsky towers, each illuminated by 4 lamps with a power of 5,000 watts each and cooled by a powerful ventilation system that not only cools the lamps but also purifies the air in the stars. As backward as Russia was then, its state stars were modern. Stars are good, but spinning stars are doubly good, because Moscow is big, there are many people, everyone needs to see the Kremlin stars.
Therefore, special bearings were installed at the base of each sprocket, which allow the stars to rotate easily and face the wind, despite their considerable weight. This makes it possible to judge which way the wind is blowing based on the arrangement of the stars. In a central control room, malfunctions were displayed in real time on the console of the electrician on duty, who then immediately set out to replace the huge incandescent lamp made of molybdenum glass, whose filaments reached almost 3000 degrees Celsius during operation. Alpinists were employed at that time to maintain and clean the Kremlin stars. To prevent overheating and damage, about 600 cubic meters of air are passed through the stars per hour. The stars are not threatened by power outages as their power supply is self-sufficient. In 2014, a comprehensive reconstruction of the star was carried out at the Spassky Tower. It received a new lighting system with several metal halide lamps with a total power of 1000 watts.
In 2015 the lamps in the Star of Trinity Tower were replaced, and in 2016 that of Nikolskaya. To this day, the ruby-red glowing state symbols of a bygone era are usually washed every 5 years. Scheduled preventive maintenance is performed monthly to maintain reliable operation. So the Kremlin always lights in Moscow nights, good for tourists because you will ever find your way back to your hotel. Everyone knows the steaming chimneys of New York's subway, the unpunctuality of Berlin's subway and the punctuality of Tokyo's. But who is knowing the metro of Moscow? Moscow's subway celebrated its 85th anniversary 2 years ago, but it is far less famous. Yet 2.5 billion people use it every year, over 7 million daily, and they don't ride just any metro, but probably the most beautiful in the world. The almighty metro. The Russians officially call their subway, but in everyday life this is of course shortened to metro. Opened in 1935, the Russian capital's metro is not only one of the largest subway systems in the world, but also the one with the deepest tunnels and stations. Anyone who takes the third escalator down here to reach an even lower station is already wondering if they're about to arrive at the center of the earth. Fortunately, the eye is always distracted and enraptured at the stations of the Moscow metro. In contrast to the dim stations of Tokyo and the desolate and dusty tunnels of Berlin, metro stations in Moscow have very sophisticated architecture. Some of them look like subterranean palaces, decorated with marble, rich sculptures and epical murals. Be careful not to miss the train while marveling. With a track length of 408 kilometers, Moscow's network has overtaken London Underground's, 402 kilometers, with New York just 70 kilometers in front.
Under the Moscow Underground, 14 lines move the whole city, at least from 5:30 in the morning to 1 o'clock at night. During this time, trains run at short intervals. Tickets are cheap, the equivalent of €1 for a single ticket. Each of Moscow's 3 airports can be reached by metro, but out there modern practicality of design already prevails. The inner-city stations with decades of history are quite different. Here chandeliers hang, artists have painted walls, the floor often consists of mosaics. The Muscovites owe this to their father Stalin, the cruel dictator, who not only murdered millions of people, but also gave the remaining ones the palace of the people, as he called the metro. For the dictator, metro was more than a means of transportation. He used the transportation system as a demonstration tool of Soviet superiority over capitalist societies. Architects were commissioned to display the ideas of Russian aesthetics on each of the stops. Splendor and glory of history next to the dazzling future of socialism were in the foreground. To enchant passengers, huge amounts of mirror-like ornamentation, murals, and chandeliers were used. The deepest station, 84 meters underground, is Victory Park, Park Pobedi, station.
Here, the passenger travels an incredible 126 meters down to see a proud Soviet soldier as a mosaic on a wall in front of a mirror-like polished mosaic floor. The depth of some of the stations has not only technical reasons. During the Cold War, some stops were built with the intention that they would serve as protection in the event of nuclear war. During this time, the magnificent architectural style was sometimes shelved in favor of a plainer design. Thus, the artworks in the stops always reflect the era in which they were created. The most important among them show the government's intention to awaken citizens' appreciation of Soviet art. Stops built during the Second World War show military motifs, those built later are more restrained in design. Surprisingly, for Germans tourists, there is free wireless LAN everywhere, in the stations and on the trains. And yet, although Muscovites read a lot on their smartphones, they still look at real books during the journey and while waiting.
Because no one has to worry about getting lost, despite the Moscow metro being a complex and extensive system, three things together make it easier to identify each line and to transfer from one line to another. Each of the lines is identified by a name, a code, numbers and letters, and a color. This is a great help in navigation, especially when transferring. On the maps in the stations and subways, the stations are marked in both the Russian alphabet and the Latin alphabet. Most of Moscow's metro lines run underground, but there are also some surface and elevated train stations. Moscow's oldest metro line, Sokonisheskaya, runs through the city on the northeast, southwest axis from Boulevard Rokossovskogo to Salaryevo. Moscow has long been using its beautiful underground stations for tourist purposes. Guided tours are offered that explain the art history of these stations.
The experts also explain that the big secret about an alleged additional subway system down some of the regular lines is just a rumor. Allegedly built to evacuate the tops of the state in emergencies like the nuclear attack, the secret army subway called D6 does not really exist. Allegedly. Sites such as St. Basil's Cathedral, Catedral de San Basilio, Red Square or Gorky Park can be easily reached by subway, otherwise there are 5 stops on Line 5 such as Kievskaya, Beloruskaya, Komsomolskaya, Novoslobodskaya and Park Kultury on Line 3, the stations Ploshchad Revoluции, Elektrozavodskaya, Kurskaya and Park Pogdy, and on Line 6, Tretyakovskaya near the world-famous Tretyakov Gallery itself are true works of art. The Kievskaya station, for example, was opened in 1954 to celebrate friendship between the Russian and Ukrainian people. Incidentally, line number 3 is the longest line at 45.1 kilometers and it takes a good hour from start to finish, although the train goes up to 100 kilometers/h, making it the fastest subway in the world. Mayakovskaya station, opened in 1938, celebrates the successes of the Soviet Union's aviation industry with 30 mosaics.
Stalin's fondness for splendor and pomp is evident in the style of socialist classicism, which is quickly reminiscent of Baroque. The pubs of Moscow. The Russians and alcohol, they have always been a loving couple. When Ivan the Terrible's troops advanced to the decisive battle, the Russian Tsar was still on guard because he knew that only after his soldiers had taken Kazan, the capital of the Tatar Empire, on October 2, 1552, did the Tsar release the vodka barrels. This was followed by 3 days of boozing with headaches, but at least without any deaths. An unmanageable amount of strange beers. Unlike in 1377, when the Russians, believing that the Tatar prince Arapshanok should be still far away, decided to get a little drunk before the battle. The Tatars surrounded the stronger Russian forces and slaughtered the entire army. Those who survived were driven by the Tatars into the nearby river, which has since been known as Reka Pianaya, Drunken River. Since then, Russians have not become more teetotal, but a little more cautious. However, anyone who goes to the Moscow bar Los Bandidos quickly notices that little has changed since 1377. If alcohol is on the menu, you can't order enough. The Russian soul opens up over beer, and table neighbors suddenly realize what a big role vodka plays in the lives of Russians.
Yet Los Bandidos is not Russian at all. Global bar culture reigns here, there are t-shirts for sale, Kalashnikovs hang on the wall, American gangsters decorate the walls and the toilet bowl is decorated with gold mosaics. Los Bandidos embodies Moscow pub style of the modern capitalist age. The young staff of the cellar store sells only local beer from small breweries, there are the strangest flavors and hardly a single one of them has less than 6%. Plus burgers on black Russian bread, organic cola, and live music. This cellar could also be in Berlin or Taipei. Russia's dazzling metropolis also has other sides. the Russian capital recently ascended to the Olympus of top gastronomy. For the first time, restaurant experts from the French Gourmet Bible Michelin awarded stars in Europe's largest city. However, only the nouveau riche and tourists frequent here, just like the students who populate the new branches of the countless coffee chains. They are all looking like Starbucks clones, but the dishes are better. Otherwise, the saying of the Venetian ambassador Contarini, who wrote home in 1476 that the Russians are great drinkers and are very proud of it, holds true. After 2 beers and a vodka, everyone is in each other's arms, even those who don't speak Russian are engaged in conversation. Contarini believed 500 years ago that Russians were good for nothing after lunch, but today it is shortly after 10 o'clock in the evening when the lights of reason go out. There is singing and drinking and singing and so on. It's not just Russian men who have been consistently drinking each other under the table for a millennium, women join in, too. Irina, sitting at our table one evening with her friend Nadia, orders refills faster than any foreigner can swallow. No wonder, just a few years ago, the average Russian downed 180 bottles of vodka a year. 180. This is accompanied by the famous soup borscht, pelmeni, and beef stroganoff, and in better circles also Kamchatka crabs, caviar, and sturgeon. It's a lifestyle. But those who keep up with the times eat pizza and burgers, because the end of communism has opened up to Russians a whole variety of national and international cuisine. In Moscow, everything is available, in any quality and at any price. You just have to be able to pay. Drinking it's expensive, says Sergei, a young Russian who invited us for beer, but somehow everyone always manages to pay for everything. And when the band plays, it doesn't matter. What was unheard of in Soviet times, Western rock music, today immediately breaks out of the strictly regulated norms of post-communist society after 5 beers and 4 vodkas.
The band Free Ride plays Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood by the American Nina Simone and everyone sings along. Good mood in a country that should actually suffer heavily from sanctions. In retaliation for import bans on Russian goods, Russian President Vladimir Putin years ago banned imports of meat, dairy products, fruit and vegetables, for example. As a result, many Russian farmers learned to make cheese like in Italy or France, and others began brewing better beer and growing wine. Mayor Sergei Sobyanin sees good Russian cuisine, along with sites like Red Square with the Kremlin, as a magnet to attract visitors from around the world. Now that the city can boast stars from the Michelin Guide, the city will be even better received by tourists, the city leader hopes. After temporary closures due to the corona pandemic, however, eateries in the metropolis of more than 12 million people are, according to press reports, it is already packed again. There are probably 10 times as many restaurants and pubs today as there were 10 years ago. Since then, several food courts have opened in the capital in huge market halls like those in Lisbon, offering everything from sushi to Uzbek and Caucasian cuisine to pizza. The fact that many Russians can hardly afford food in the new restaurants and pubs, because monthly wages are still a few €100 and pensions around €200. No one cares. There remain enough people to whom it is worth the money, and for visitors Moscow offers a good price-performance ratio in international comparison. Russian heroes. For every Russian it is clear, if you have not visited the Kremlin, you have not seen Moscow. Millions of people are drawn every year to the historical and political center of Russia, from which tsars, comrades, and presidents ruled. 3 million guests visit every year, making the Kremlin the most visited museum in Moscow. But if you really want to understand the Russians, you first have to visit one of the modern pubs and drink vodka and home-brewed beer with Russians all night long. And he must also go where Russians remember what happened to them 80 years ago, that was when Nazi Germany began its invasion of the Soviet Union. Although hardly any contemporary witnesses are still alive who themselves fought against the aggressors for almost 4 years, the Great Patriotic War is still the piece of history that unites all Russians today. The pride of having been victorious at that time is unmistakable in every person Nan talks to. And the museums that Russia has built for the heroes of that time dwarf everything else that exists in the Russian capital in the way of commemorative sites. That's no so easy because Moscow has all in all, 450 museums and exhibition halls where ancient, modern, or applied art, history, literature or science can be viewed and admired. But the soul of the nation rests here, in the state-of-the-art war museum called the Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War, Russian. Even the main building on Poklonnaya Hill, address Bratyev Fonkenko St. is imposing as few. In a wide arc the palatial house stretches on the hill under a sky with dark clouds. Near here, less than 100 kilometers away, the fate of the world turned when the onslaught of the German Wehrmacht was shattered by the fierce resistance of the Russians in the legendary Battle of Moscow. 4 years later, the troops of Marshal Zhukov, who had already defeated Hitler before Moscow, were in Berlin, and the German dictator killed himself. The museum at the place of the beginning of the end of the Supreme Nazi shows an impressive amount of tanks, artillery, and airplanes. In addition, there are bunkers and other authentic equipment of the defenders but also of the attackers to see and to touch. On tanks children can climb. You can see German railroads, built to destroy rail lines in retreat. And Russian weapons of success, such as the T-34 tank and the famous Stalin organ. A tour takes time, because around the dome-shaped Museum of the Great Patriotic War is a whole collection of military equipment from World War II. All exhibits have information panels in English, so the tanks, cannons, planes, trains, and ships of the Soviet, German, American and Japanese armies are very interesting even for laymen. Howls of triumph are nowhere to be heard. The Russians present their victory with quiet dignity. They know what they have done for the whole World War II. The Museum of Victory leaves you mute as you tour the years from 1941 to 1945, the most horrific period in Russian history. Especially if you're German. There is a collection of over thousands of exhibits from private collections, along with pictures of soldiers, maps, chronicles and scientific descriptions of famous personalities and historical battles. Already the way to the museum, the construction of which began on March 3, 1986, becomes a commemorative march. Soldiers are depicted on stele in heroic poses, decorated with fresh flowers, but presented in a very restrained manner. The Red Army soldiers have been fighting for Mother Homeland, Rodina, as it is called in Russian, since its opening on May 9, 1995, which is always Victory Day for the Russians. Today the wide place is breathtaking. Nearby stands a new magnificent military church with tank reliefs on the outside and meter-high mosaics on the inside. Dictator Joseph Stalin is also not missing, who after all, as many Russians praise to this day, not only brutally killed millions of his personal enemies in the country, but also organized the victory over Hitler. Nearby also stand a memorial synagogue to the show, a memorial mosque, a triumphal arch and an obelisk to the nation's heroes. Quite modern and almost American look the souvenir store with Stalin dolls, rubber soldiers, and plastic tanks. There are also almost real uniform parts, helmets, and Red Army caps, as well as books, maps, and films. If you are hungry after all this war, you can get something to eat next door. A kiosk offers Coke, beer, and cake, soup and sausages. The man promoting the American cell phone manufacturer Apple in the middle of Moscow has sat down on a bench for a moment. But all around him, life is roaring on the Russian capital's busiest street, the Arbat, a legendary stretch of road that runs for about a kilometer through the historic center. Moscow is still really old here, not far from the Kremlin. The Arbat, actually an entire neighborhood around the street, has existed since the 15th century and is thus one of the oldest streets in the Russian capital that has survived to the present day. At the Arbat. Originally, this wide road was part of an important traffic route between Asia and Western Europe. Therefore, many craftsmen settled here already in the Middle Ages. The first documented reference to the Arbat dates back to July 28, 1493, when a nearby church building, the wooden church of St. Nicholas on the Sand, suffered a fire that quickly spread throughout Moscow and devastated large parts of the city, which was built primarily of wood at the time. 500 years later, Arbat, the name maybe comes from Arabic meaning suburb or outskirts, developed into the most popular residential district of the middle and minor nobility, artists, and academics. The suburb was chic and close to the center of power at the Kremlin, at the same time it was far enough away that life could be a bit more casual. Old heritage that made the invitingly wide piece of Moscow the first pedestrian boulevard of the Eastern Bloc even in communist times. From Arbatskaya Square you can walk southwest to Smolenskaya Square, and look down a lot of side streets until you reach the crossroads with the Garden Ring. There it is better to turn around, because the continuation of the Arbat in the western direction is the 8-lane Smolenskaya Street. Today the Arbat is a pedestrian zone of western layout. This is where the poet and singer Bulat Okudsheva grew up. His father was Georgian, his mother Armenian. Both were arrested, convicted, and deported in the course of Stalin's purges in 1937. The father perished, the mother survived the inhumane treatment in notorious camps.
Only after more than a decade did she see her son again. Alexander Pushkin also lived here for a short time after he got married. The house, which later served as a normal residence for many years, was restored after the end of the Soviet Union as it was during Pushkin's lifetime. However, the favorite district of artists and high earners attracts tourists and Russians above all because there is always something going on here. Street musicians, street artists, and souvenir sellers swarm around each other, break dancers dance, book tables stand in the middle of the street and costumed advertising figures run around. If you can't make it to the Ismailovsky flea market on the outskirts of town, you're guaranteed to find all the Russia souvenirs you could want here, too. For many tourists, a stroll is therefore a must. However, most people don't know the fact that the last remnants of what was once the world's second largest economic alliance overshadow the Arbat from afar. To this day, the great joint work of steel, glass, and concrete 31 stories high into the Moscow sky that the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, CMEA, founded in 1949, had erected in 1967 as a sign of its strength. 7 states of the organization, known in English as Comecon, built the headquarters for the Economic Alliance of Socialist Countries, of which maybe no one today knows anymore what it once was. At the Arbat one knows. On both sides of the street there are cafes, galleries, and stores selling everything from matryoshkas to Putin t-shirts and Soviet army coats, all of which seem exotic and Soviet to Western and Chinese tourists. Lenin heads, Stalin t-shirts, the flirtation with the communist past is just as cleverly calculated here as with the doubles who have themselves photographed around the Red Square as Stalin, Lenin, or Rasputin. But you can also shop normally here, just like everywhere else in the West. And even in the same stores of the big Western brands. Between them, however, genuine Russian eateries offer here, between the Eastern Arbatskaya metro station, whose red reception building was built in the shape of a 5-pointed Soviet star, and the end at the Russian Foreign Ministry, there must be hundreds. It's a great area to stroll and look, pick up nonsensical souvenirs and try on old Russian military leather coats. Since the spacious pedestrian street is so full of cafes, bars, and restaurants, you can also take a proper rest and drink every few meters. In terms of urban planning, it is noticeable while you sitting down, the Arbat is anything but pretty. Next to the old, historic houses, there are not only restored palaces and churches, but also postmodern buildings and skyscrapers, 20 to 30 stories high, in which the aspiring middle class is at home. In Russia, chrome and glass are still seen by many as a reflection of the new prosperity, but others make fun of them and disparagingly call the square skyscrapers iron teeth. Glaring neon signs hang from them, outshining the silent splendor of Simeon Stilites Church next door. Eating in Moscow. Have you ever eaten a Russian tortellini filled with minced meat like in an American burgers? Pelmeni, as the Russians call their tortellini, however, are reminiscent of pale pasta made of dough, turned out a bit too big and served plain or with sour cream. It's true. They are larger than the Italian original and have nothing at all to do with a burger apart from the filling, because the minced meat is cooked, not fried. Russians, however, love this special pale pockets and sometimes give them fillings of blueberries, raspberries, or whatever else they have at the hand. Not that this is little. Even after many years of Western sanctions against the largest country in Europe, which is also the largest country in Asia, the shelves in Moscow supermarkets are well stocked. There is everything from everywhere. Chocolate from Switzerland, rice from China, sweets from Germany, jam from Denmark and fish from Norway, but also beer from the Netherlands, crisp bread from Sweden and meat from Spain. Prices are cheap, though not for most of the locals, whose wages are quite far from those in the West. The Russians enjoy the food all the more when it is on the table. When invited to share a meal, it is considered normal for the tabletop to bend under the weight of the food. Even in restaurants, the portions are huge. Russians prefer not to eat many courses in full rather than settle for one dish. And when they eat, as can be seen in restaurants at neighboring tables, they chew and swallow, they snack and chow, they get up and go out for a smoke, they have a vodka in between, a beer with it, another course, and another vodka. In between, they indulge in something sweet and then another little nibble. Before the next round. Mealtime in Moscow. Russia has, like many other countries, a wide range of typical dishes that are little known in most other parts of the world. Those who get involved in Russian cuisine get to know a true paradise for gourmets, which is especially interesting for people who are curious about foods that are not available anywhere else. A second kind of dumplings belongs to it, which is more like empanadas or samosa and is called piroshki, pierogi or pierogi. These dumplings are filled with white cabbage and minced meat or vegetarian ingredients, such as mushrooms. The pierogi is often accompanied by the famous stew okryshka with caviar or a vegetarian soup called shchi, which contains brown mushrooms, sauerkraut and potatoes in addition to carrots. Much better known, at least in Europe, is borscht, a vegetarian soup that looks like pasta sauce but is made not from tomatoes but from beet. This makes it look blood red, redder even than perhaps the best-known soup from Russia, solyanka. The Russians supposedly invented the solyanka in the worst times of famine. Everything that was still in the house was simply whirled into one pod. So there is the solyanka with meat and with fish, but also only with vegetables. Less is more, because this leaves more room for the main course, which can reach enormous dimensions in a Russian restaurant, as Moscow has countless of them. Shashlik from the oven with a delicious sauce, minced schnitzel with a mushroom and cheese filling, and the world-famous beef stroganoff are Russian classics, some of which have also made it into international cuisine. Then, to finish, a buckwheat risotto with mushrooms and then very, very sweet cake. But don't worry, no one in Moscow is forced to eat completely according to the traditions of the locals. In recent years, Western-style pubs, restaurants, and cafes have sprung up all over the city. There are Italians and Greeks, Spanish specialty restaurants and American coffee chains, most of which, however, do not bear the signet of the world market leader from Seattle, but rather its interior design ideas translated into Russian. Advantage: in the imitation Starbucks stores, there is not only an emergency breakfast, but breakfast in the Russian style, so many dishes that a normal person will never be able to manage everything. The same, of course, goes for drinks in the evening. Anyone who thinks they can engage in a vodka duel with Russians and win must have trained hard for years beforehand. Because while they swallow funny little fish, caviar, and slices of bread, the Russians devour vodka and beer at warp speed. At the flea market. Here you can find everything. Everything. At least everything that no one needs. All that, whatever no one has never ever needed. Or will ever need. There is nonsense.
Hats, real and fake antiques, works of art of real geniuses and unrecognized artists, jackets of the Russian army, shoes of astronauts, stamps, knives, bears, wolves, guns, cartridges, wooden matryoshka dolls in every imaginable variety. The choice is almost endless. Old women knitting socks. Old men carve walking sticks. Little gangsters selling billboards with communist slogans. That's how it is, the vernissage market of Ismaelovo on the eastern outskirts of Moscow. A little outside the city, but easy to get to, lies the Mecca for tourists, souvenir hunters, and lovers of all obscure things under the sun, accessible by subway and then a stroll through one of the Russian capital's many parks. The metro ride to Partizanskaya station, dark blue line, takes 20 minutes from the center. From Partizanskaya to Ismailovo market is about further 10 minutes walk. Probably nowhere in Russia is the selection of handicrafts, junk and bric-a-brac greater than here. What began in socialist times as a huge flea market where underserved Russians could find what was available nowhere else, now takes place amid pseudo-historic settings. In the Russian architectural style of the 16th century, a rather imposing fantasy Kremlin was rammed out of the ground here around the turn of the millennium. Behind it, life rages today in its own way. Flea markets in Russia are different from those in Germany, the USA, or Asia. It's true that you can find rare and old items here, too, because older people in particular often have to part with things they've grown fond of in order to supplement their meager pensions. The rest, however, are goods that are specially carted together to please lovers of funny, nonsensical, or purposeless things. A clock with Hitler and Stalin on the dial, a cutlery box with a picture of Friedrich Engels, a t-shirt with Vladimir Putin and one with Lenin, the father of the Russian Revolution. The atmosphere is just as quirky. Right next to a group of huge skyscrapers built for the 1980 Olympics, Red Army uniforms hang next to Gucci sunglasses from Siberian factories next to fake icons and old Russian records. Under the artists are the Rolling Stones. But not on vinyl, this kind of records are really made from thin foil. Since the area was thoroughly remodeled, there are also snack bars, restaurants, and beer stands in the recreated ancient Kremlin. The wooden fortress with colorful towers, built in 2001 supposedly according to sketches from the 14th to 17th centuries, even has an Orthodox church, making it a real tourist trap. With kids playing in plastic tanks. Ismailovo Kremlin is undoubtedly much more colorful than the real Kremlin in the city center. It reminds of a Russian fairy tale and fulfills all expectations of Russian cliché images. Everything here is full of national colors, flags, souvenirs and junk. Every day for 10 hours, people can haggle and trade.
People can haggle and trade at the Ismailovo market, but with a foreseeable result, everything you buy is always far too well priced for sure. Anything else would be dangerous, because buying real antiques can lead to trouble in Russia. According to Russian laws, objects over 50 years old cannot be taken abroad. An official permit is required for this. But for really valuable objects, of course, there is no such permission. So it's better to take a second or third matryoshka, revolutionary porcelain, thick shapkas made of artificial bear fur and magnets with motifs from the Soviet space program.
You will be doing a favor to the matkas, very old mothers, and atats, old fathers, who hawk the old books, the worn-out clothes and the worthless ruble coins of times long past. There are several other flea markets in Moscow, which is after all the largest city in Europe, for example at the Preobrazhenskaya Plощad metro station. Here pensioners stand and try to get rid of parts of their household goods to get some money in the case. From battered wardrobe to stamps from Soviet times, heroic medals, old shoes, paintings and homemade flower arrangements, there is more here that no one needs. At the Levsha market, the largest very in the Russian capital, located in the north of Moscow on Novoshodninskoye Highway and open only on weekends, fans of the Soviet era will find what they are looking for. If you are a fan of Stalin, of the Cold War, the WW2, of communism or the signs of any other murderous socialist organization, here you can find everything of their legacy. Everything. At least everything that happily no one needs anymore. All that what hopefully will never ever need it again from anybody. To be able to read a little Russian, Cyrillic letters, does not hurt. Advertising, which has Moscow flooded at the same time as Western goods, may contain only Cyrillic letters, according to the order of the mayor. Without this rule, the mayor says, there is a risk of too much Americanization of the Russian capital. The faces of the city.
The faces of the city. Look at this young girl. She could be a model from everywhere. How she stood in the street. Her mobile is glowing, her eyes behind sunglasses, and she wears a huge scarf against the cold of Moscow. A Russian girl she is, a girl from everywhere. She stands in the streets of the Russian capital so proud and beautiful as only woman can stand. It's a picture of the cool energy as only Moscow has it. A city full of noise, full of strangers, full of nice and, yes, unfriendly people. Moscow is fast, loud and interesting in all its facets. Those who live here have learned to assert themselves against life. He asserts himself in a city that does not take prisoners. And it doesn't matter whether he is a waiter, saleswoman, or construction worker, whether she sweeps the dirt off the street or goes shopping in the most expensive department store. Everything in Moscow is different from anywhere else. And at the same time completely the same. Moscow puzzles its visitors. How can it be that Russians are so incredibly friendly? And then fight each other for minutes on the street in the evening? How can there be people in a city like this who make their living from wandering the streets with a large bird of prey? And who is the old man who looks like the legendary Rasputin? The lover of the Russian queen, like another strange song says. Rasputin was the man who advised the Tsar and betrayed them. He was powerful and later murdered by his enemies. But now he lives again with a white beard and a face like the real one. Young soldiers march in a parade at the Kremlin, their faces
But
unmoved.
behind the scenes they cackle and grin like schoolboys. It's like a school trip. Dobro utro. Good morning they call. And then they willingly let themselves be photographed in their colorful uniforms. Many years ago the English musician Sting wrote a great song about these Russians, Videolink, that tells exactly this story. This fourth single from the album The Dream of the Blue Turtles reached the top 30 in 9 countries and brought the fear of the Cold War to a point. There's no such thing as a winnable war, it's a lie we don't believe anymore, Mr. Reagan says, we will protect you. I don't subscribe to this point of view, sang Sting, who used to be a singer the band the Polyphs had been. Believe me when I say to you I hope the Russians love their children too. Yes, you learn that when you are out and about in Moscow, we share the same biology, regardless of ideology, but what might save us, me and you, is if the Russians love their children too. They do. Drink with them, laugh with them, look at them and try to understand their wonderful and so strange language. Sting was
inspired to write Russians during the Cold War after watching a pirated satellite Russian broadcast of Russian children's television programming and realizing Russians love their children just as we do. He then took the melody from the piece Lieutenant Kitty Suite, which the Russian composer Prokofiev had written. And Sting even tried to fly to Moscow to record his song there. But times were not like that. The leaders of the Communist Soviet Union would not let him into the country. Sting later made it clear that Russians was not a pro-Soviet song, but a pro-children song. They are the same in Russia as they are everywhere. But so do the adults. Here in Moscow, Muscovites also complain about dirt in the hallway and on the streets, even if they have much less reason to do so than the residents of Berlin, Hamburg, or Cologne, 3 German cities, who imagine they are very, very clean. Moscow is cleaner. It also has a lot less pictures smeared on the walls. No, that's not true, Moscow doesn't have any. Everywhere there is constant sweeping, cleaning and polishing. Who asks how it works together, often gets the information that the old Soviet times are to blame. She simply expelled people from any individual sense of responsibility for their surroundings, but instilled obedience into them. But the young people you talk to laugh at that. They are neither obedient nor Soviet, but citizens of the world, orientated towards the West and anxious to earn money simply because of the high cost of living. Everyone talks about the stark difference between rich and poor, but everyone suffers from it. They all meet in the center of the city, the homeless, the lotto drivers and those who are chauffeured in a Mercedes. They live next to each other, in the same city, but not necessarily in the same world. The break can also be seen from the outside of the old buildings from the Stalin era. Here are the ones with new windows with double glass, next to them with the old, drafty wooden frames. Russian logic: after the end of the Soviet Union, it was not the houses that were sold, but individual apartments. Those who had enough money gave their four walls an Evro remont, a European renovation. Because European is good, a sign of quality. But you know, every Russian has his own idea of what it means. The beggar has different one as the young girl with the Gucci bag. The woman who is showing her grandma how a mobile works has another as a patriotic fighting ma with the Russian flag. No one can be kinder to visitors than a Russian. There is no rejection from them, only interest. Which also gets bigger with every glass of vodka. Even if they don't understand their counterpart, they listen with interest as if the guest had come from another cosmos. What we are told in the news, how terrible it all is with Russia, with the Russian president, with the Russian army, the people on the other side of the table really shake their heads. And the Russians can't believe it. Yes, Russians really love their children just as much as everyone else.
Пойдешь направо, ты ведь королева, ты имеешь право на любовь. Потому что